Hello, friends, and welcome to our discussion, Should We Have a Third Founding? The topic could not be more important. I'm so excited to have this conversation with my friend and longtime colleague, Sherrilyn Ifill, one of America's greatest scholars of the 14th Amendment, founder of a new center at Howard University devoted to shining light on the 14th Amendment. I'm Jeff Rosen from the National Constitution Center, and we are going to talk about what was the second founding. And we're going to do a deep dive into its constitutional legacy and what it can teach us today during this transformative moment of constitutional challenge. Sherrilyn, the second founding is a phrase coined by the historian Eric Foner to describe the towering achievement of the post-Civil War amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the 14th, which guaranteed equal protection, due process, and privileges and immunities, and the 15th, which extended voting rights to African-American men. And yet that second founding was subverted by violent white supremacist reaction and by the Supreme Court, which struck down so many of the towering laws that Congress enacted to enforce the Reconstruction amendments. As we begin by digging into those amendments and their subversion, how would you describe the second founding and what can we learn from it?
Great. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. And for those of you who have never been to the National Constitution Center, make a trip. I am a very pragmatic person about our Constitution, but I get choked up every time I'm in there. It's just an incredibly beautiful place, and so I hope you'll go in Philadelphia. A number of you have come from the last session on 6 Days to Save Democracy, and so you're feeling a little shook. Get it? I totally get it. I totally get it. And I don't have much to add to what you just saw. But the purpose of talking about the third founding is to talk about what has been my preoccupation for the last few years since I stepped down from leading the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, when every day I was involved in what was happening every day. What I wanted to do was to begin to look a little bit to the future and to try to think through and try to begin a conversation about how we create the country that we want. No matter what happens in November's election, on the other side of it, we need to have some serious conversations about where we're going in this country. If we are honest, for those of us, assembled here, we are the people for whom America has worked out well. Okay? But the truth is, as we can see, we've largely run out of runway on the America that you and I grew up with and knew and understood. And something new is going to be on the other side. And we have the opportunity to create the country we really want. I've been a civil rights lawyer for 30 years, so I'm not nostalgic about some wonderful period of Shangri-La when everything was great, because I've never been out of work. So for me, it is more about how do we begin to create the country we want? And for me, the anchoring is in that second founding. The second founding that happened as a result of the Civil War. Now, if I ask folks in here to just shout out names of the founders of our country, just shout out some names. Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, Jay, Washington, all of the above. Franklin, yes. No one said Bingham. No one said Charles Bingham, who largely wrote the 14th Amendment. No one said Charles Sumner. No one said Thaddeus Stevens. No one said the names of the other founders and framers, the people who influenced what became the 14th Amendment. No one said Frederick Douglass. No one said Susan B. Anthony. No one said Elizabeth Cady Stanton. No one said any of those names. And yet we've had essentially a second founding in this country that for some reason no one really is taught about. And we revere and talk all the time about the tricorn hats and 1789 and Independence Hall, and understandably so. But what we don't talk about are the people who stitched this country back together after the Civil War. And what they created after ratifying the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and passing a series of civil rights statutes thereafter was to create the country that you and I mostly know of as America. That's the country we grew up in. The post-Civil War America. So it begins for me with what was the second founding. It was the effort to create a new nation. And a new nation was created. Now, it doesn't mean that the entire First Nation was jettisoned, but it was this process of building on that first Constitution, going back and correcting some of the unconscionable compromises. And so if you look at the 14th Amendment, the first line of it, is birthright citizenship. Every person born in the United States is a citizen of the United States, born or naturalized in the United States, is a citizen of the United States and of the state in which they reside, right? The part 2 talks about counting persons for purposes of representation. So they had to overcome the 3/5 compromise that counted enslaved people as less than a person for purposes of representation. They had to overturn the Dred Scott decision. All of this was done in this second founding. And the use of this word equal, or the concept of equal protection, this was the founders reaching back over the first Constitution, which had made all the compromises about equality, which said the slave trade could go on until 1808, which talked about the importation of persons. They reached back over the first Constitution to the Declaration of Independence, where those words, "We know these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." That's what we think of as our national identity. But it's not in that first Constitution. It is the second Constitution. It is the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal protection of laws that reaches back over the first Constitution to enshrine our national identity, the one we talk about all the time, but apparently no one knows where it comes from. So it is powerful. It is the remaking of our country. And unfortunately, much of it was hijacked, which we can talk about in a moment. But it's first important to understand what it was. That we live in a second founding country, a country in which slavery is unconstitutional, a country in which there is birthright citizenship, which was designed to ensure citizenship for both formerly enslaved and free Black people, because the Dred Scott decision had declared that Black people could not be citizens, had made Black people, even if they were free, stateless people. That was the purpose of it. But how many people in this room's families, over the course of 20th century immigration from Europe, benefited from birthright citizenship and from naturalized citizenship? It transformed the demography of this country. To the extent we call ourselves a nation of immigrants, it only is instantiated because of birthright citizenship, which, by the way, was not necessarily the norm at that time. You were French because your mother was French. But we decided on birthright citizenship, and that touched every single person in this country. So to understand the power of that second founding is first and foremost what I think is powerfully important. And then I would just say the second thing that's important for purposes of this conversation and the moment we're in our country is that the substance, and we'll talk about the substance of the 14th Amendment, is important, but it also is the spirit of the thing. It's showing us we can refresh our democracy. We have the power to renew. I don't think it requires a civil war. I don't think it even necessarily requires a constitutional amendment, although I can think of one or two I might like. But it shows that we can still be a country. Not only do we have the power, we have the obligation to refresh ourselves, to repair ourselves, to make ourselves new. And that's the project and the work that's before us today. Not just getting through another election so that 3 years from now we can once again be talking about 6 days to save democracy. It's time for us to show that we have the courage and the power and the commitment of those framers of the second founding.
Wonderful, so powerfully put. And so important to note that, first, some applause, that the second founding is a fulfillment of the promise of the Declaration, and that from the founding until the Civil War, heroic Black and white freedom fighters invoked the Declaration to argue that slavery had to end. And starting with Prince Hall in 1777, David Walker, the great Frederick Douglass, who insisted that the Constitution was a glorious liberty document and should be interpreted to end slavery rather than allow it. There were defenders of liberty from the beginning who invoked the Declaration to end slavery. What I want to try to do, Sherrilyn, this is a precious time. Let me try to give a shot at encapsulating the constitutional achievement of the Second Founding and its subversion in 5 minutes, and you'll see how I did, and then we'll dig in deeper. Because, as Sherrilyn said, it's important for you to know this history, to think about people like John Bingham and Charles Sumner's the Second Founding, and here is their story. Imagine John Bingham, a congressman from Ohio, before the Civil War, listening to David Walker and Frederick Douglass and being convinced that slavery violated the promise of the Declaration, and being convinced that Congress already had the power to protect the privileges or immunities of black and white citizens in all states, including the right to read and not to have their newspapers banned in the mails, not to be the victim of racist lynching and violence, not to be denied the right to make and enforce contracts. But it was necessary to put that explicitly in the Constitution in order to make it a reality. So the war came, as Lincoln said. And then Bingham proposed the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The first sentence says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the states and of the states wherein they reside. As Sherrilyn said, that's designed to overturn the Dred Scott decision, which had said that black people have no rights which the white man is bound to respect, and to ensure that everyone born in the United States is a birthright citizen. The next sentence says that all persons born in the United States are entitled to the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. What are those privileges or immunities? They're the rights to sue and be sued, to make contracts, to inherit property, to read and exercise your First Amendment rights, all of the rights which the Civil War had banished. Then it goes on to say that no state shall make or enforce any law that deprives all persons in the United States of life, liberty, or property, nor deny to any person the equal protection of the law. Note that distinction between the privileges or immunities of citizens, which are guaranteed by the earlier sentence, but then all persons, alien and citizens alike, are entitled not to be the victim of racist violence, not to have their protection assaulted, and to ensure that they have a basic security of property. So that's the first section. Then the second section says, what about black voting rights? The whole point of the Reconstruction amendments, in Lincoln's view, was to ensure voting rights for black people. And in the last speech that he gave in 1863, right before he was assassinated, he demanded black voting rights. John Wilkes Booth heard that and said, he's going to have to die. And he shot him because he promised black suffrage. And Bingham and Frederick Douglass and Lincoln all believed that voting rights were the king's cure that would ensure equality. But when it came time to pass the voting rights, the 14th Amendment, there weren't enough votes to ensure black voting rights, and they weren't able to protect it. Therefore, Section 2 says, if the South denies voting rights to black people, they have to suffer a corresponding reduction in apportionment in the House, and so that they won't be able to deny black voting rights but still get a bonanza in apportionment. Section 3 says, what about the former insurrectionists, Jeff Davis and Alexander Hamilton Stevens and all the leaders of the insurrection? They must be deprived of holding any office of trust or profit under the United States if they've sworn an oath to defend the United States and broken it in the insurrection. And then there's also a provision which many thought was the most important in the whole amendment. What happens if the South repudiates the war debt and expects the North to pay it? And the amendment says that the North does not have to assume the war debt. That's become really relevant in current debates about the debt ceiling. So that's the 14th Amendment. What happens next?
Wait, you got to give Section 5.
Oh, sorry, you're absolutely right. Well, you're absolutely right. I do. because the Supreme Court did not. And Section 5, Sherrilyn is completely right. Congress shall have the power to enforce this amendment by appropriate legislation. The whole point of the amendment is to empower Congress explicitly to protect black civil rights. Because when Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which enacted many of these promises, Andrew Johnson vetoed the bill. And he wanted to subvert Reconstruction, and he was determined not to ensure black voting rights. And the whole point of the amendment was to ensure that Congress had the power to do what Johnson didn't want it to do. So that was Section 5. What happens next? Well, Congress passes enforcement acts to ensure that black rights are protected. The 15th Amendment is passed, granting black voting rights. The Force Acts are passed, and there's a violent resistance. And there are riots in New Orleans and across the country. There are lynchings, and there's a reign of terror. And in a remarkable moment at the Colfax massacre in Louisiana, black men take to the federal courthouse to defend the rightly elected office holders. 300 white terrorists show up, murder 60 black people, and they are prosecuted under this new law, which has been designed for the enforcement of black voting rights. What does the Supreme Court do? In a shocking opinion, it's the only word, Justice Joseph Bradley says that Congress has no power to enact the Force Act because it can only protect acts of private violence, not public violence, and this was private and not public. It is one of the most shocking bits of legalism in U.S. history, and it totally eviscerated the possibility of giving the muscle that Congress had intended to give in Section 5 and actually enforce black voting rights. And then the subversion continues. Congress, during the shining last moment of Reconstruction in 1875, had passed a Civil Rights Act, which gave black people the right to go to theaters, to use public transportation on equal terms as white people. And in 1883, Joseph Bradley, again, really one of the most notorious figures in Supreme Court history, strikes the act down and says that Congress can't pass it because discrimination in theaters and public places is private and not state action, and therefore we have to wait another almost 100 years for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So the story, and I hope that was as tightly as I could do it, is a story of, thank you.
Give him, I mean, you have no idea.
It's important, it takes time, but it's important to learn the history, and it's important to read it and to take some time with it because it's complicated. But what's so poignant about this history is that those founders were so explicit about their goals, and the Supreme Court was so shameless, shocking in ignoring their original understanding. We're living in a time of originalism when the founders' intention is supposed to matter. And these are founders who said what they were trying to do, and the Supreme Court just didn't care. The final example of this, John Bingham wanted to incorporate the Bill of Rights against the states so that the states were prohibited from denying free speech rights, from denying Second Amendment rights, from allowing the privileges or immunities of citizenship. And Bingham stood up in Congress and he said, I read the decision by John Marshall where he said, if you wanted to apply the Bill of Rights against the states, you would have said so explicitly. I'm saying so explicitly by using John Marshall's language, no state shall enforce, the same way that Marshall said, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. So Bingham is standing up in Congress and saying, I mean to enforce the Bill of Rights against the states. And Bradley, again, the villain of this story, in a notorious opinion, joins the Supreme Court in saying that the basic rights of the Bill of Rights don't apply against the states. And the concern is federalism, that this would transform the relationship between the state and the federal governments, and therefore we can't imagine that the founders meant to do that, even though Bingham actually stood up and said that he did intend that. And again, it took another 100 years. This is the great drama of constitutional interpretation in the 20th century to actually make real what Bingham had tried to do when he stood up in Congress. So there we go.
That was fantastic. Let me add a little flavor to some of these elements. A couple of things to note about the Reconstruction Amendments, and particularly the 14th Amendment, which Jeff was just alluding to at the end. Because we hear a lot about states' rights today, and some of you are from a generation where if people said states' rights, you knew what it meant. It means the same thing, by the way, today when they're saying it. But the point of these amendments was actually to calibrate the relationship between the federal and the state government as it relates to these rights. They actually meant to saying states' rights and federalism is not helpful because that was the whole point. That's why all three, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, all have enforcement clauses that give Congress the power, as Jeff said, to enforce the provisions of the amendments. There was a recognition that there are some things for which we cannot trust the states. Okay? And these are folks who had seen the worst of it. I mean, we shouldn't gloss over what they were facing. This is, again, the courage of this moment, right? Try to imagine the country decimated, the South decimated. Every family, North and South, has lost someone in this Civil War, right? Now we have to go on and try to stitch together a new country. You have this recalcitrance in the South even after the Civil War. And the one man who was believed to be the one person who could hold the Union together is assassinated. That's the context in which they're creating this. So this is an incredible feat that they are pulling together. So their recognition, one, is that we can't trust the states around some of this stuff, and so we have to create this robust congressional power in order to ensure that these rights are protected. There is this struggle, as Jeff talked about, between those who kind of thought, well, the war is over, let's just move on. This may sound familiar to you. The insurrection is over, let's just move on. Maybe we shouldn't really do anything. Maybe we shouldn't prosecute. Maybe we shouldn't do anything about it. We should just keep it going. That's the President Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's vice president, who was a Southerner and absolutely believed in the inferiority of black people. That was his idea of Reconstruction, that we just move on now. These founders in Congress were deeply concerned about this. They knew that that would be a mistake. And so one of the pieces I love about this period is a kind of study that they did of the South. Andrew Johnson sends his good friend Carl Schurz to the South to look at the conditions and to report back to him. He's hoping to get a really good report that Southerners are chastened, that we're now all going to get along, and that it's going to be fantastic. The Joint Committee that is creating the 14th Amendment and drafting it also engages in a study, and they come back, and their reports are very similar. Carl Schurz is shocked at what he finds. He talks about, and we hear this from Frederick Douglass, we hear this from Carl Schurz, we hear this from the Joint Committee, the spirit of insurrection and the ongoing allegiance to white supremacy that are the two things they find in the South. The spirit of insurrection, he says, treason hardly seems like it's a wrongdoing to them. And the ongoing white supremacy. And by this time, we're having black codes. These are laws that are being created to basically return black people to slavery. If you're found on the road without a paper saying what white person you work for, you can be taken into custody and compelled to work for someone. Your children can be taken and made to serve as apprentices until they're 21 years old, and so on and so forth. People are being violently whipped. They're being shot. There's no recourse. And all of this is happening, and Carl Schurz includes it in his report. And he says, it may be true now that no one white person can own one black person, but it is certainly as though all of the whites still own all of the blacks. That's what he finds, and that's what he reports back. The Joint Commission is deeply concerned because no sooner does Congress sit than who shows up? 4 former Confederate generals, various other members of the Confederate military showed up saying, the Georgians just elected us, we want our seats in Congress. And this is the genesis of Section 3, where they realize they want to come back to power. They want to achieve, they said, with the gavel, that which they could not achieve with the gun. And I do think it's important to remember that they were studying something about the spirits that exist in our country, what is in our DNA. And it is our country, and so we have to accept that these things exist in our country, that there is a spirit of white supremacy that continues to exist in our country, that there is a spirit of insurrection among some that exists in this country and that has to be managed. And that's what Section 3 of the 14th Amendment was about. Frederick Douglass said about the spirit of insurrection, the reason he thought voting rights was so important for black people is he said, this spirit will be passed from sire to son. It will not die out in a year. It will not die out in an age. And what I believe we should have is a little bit of humility. This is where I have my problem with the Supreme Court Section 3 decision. These were people who deeply studied this country. Frederick Douglass is one of the few people who actually was enslaved, who actually then became an abolitionist, who walked in the corridors of power, and he understood this country very deeply. And this was a warning. So that flavor is tremendously important. On the hijacking of the promise of the 14th Amendment, it is one of the, it's a great tragedy. It's a great tragic story of this country. All of these decisions that Jeff talked about, the Cruikshank decision, the Colfax massacre. On January 6th, I was at my house. I had thought something would happen, and so I had security at my house. And as I watched it, it looked familiar. It looked like every sketched drawing I had seen of what the Colfax massacre might have looked like when these hundreds attacked the courthouse to try to get at the ballots in an election that they lost. And the subversion of that prosecution, the subversion of these enforcement acts that were designed to protect Black people, the subversion of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, in which Justice Bradley said, so this is 1883 is the civil rights cases, is the Supreme Court case striking down the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and Justice Bradley says this is 20 years after slavery ended. How long must the Black man continue to be the special favorite of the laws? When a man has been removed from chains, how long must we continue to have this solicitude, right? This is as Black people are being killed throughout the South. Also important to remember that Congress held a series of hearings called the Ku Klux Klan hearings, which again, very few people talk about, in which they invited Black people to come and testify about what the Klan was doing in the South. It is the most harrowing reading. I couldn't even do class after my students read it. It's so harrowing to hear, and the courage of people to come and tell what was happening to them. That was the basis upon which Congress created these enforcement acts that were so easily swept away by the Supreme Court. And then we end with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which opens up and enshrines Jim Crow for another 60 years. I want you to think about all of the suffering that happened in that period. I want you to think about the 5,000 recorded lynchings. I want you to think about all of the lost opportunities of employment, of housing, of education that happened for Black people in this country and that continues to reverberate in the wealth disparity, in ongoing lack of housing access, in crime, in education. I want you to think about what that means. It's not just like the Supreme Court made some decision and that was a bad thing. It is that millions and tens of millions of people suffered as a result of it. And those decisions were a subversion of what Congress wanted. And we are living, all of us, with the consequences of it. Now, the good news is that there was an effort to try and revive the 14th Amendment, what we would call the second refounding, I guess, and that was the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was an attempt to resubstantiate the 14th Amendment, right? Was to give it all meaning again, was to challenge segregation, was to challenge the fact that even though Black people should be able to vote, they couldn't vote. All of that happened, and I think it's the pride of this country. I think it's part of our national story that we take pride in that this happened. I want us to think about it as a way in which we refounded our country without war and without even constitutional amendments. We did it off the backs of ordinary people. There was absolutely bloodshed. There were people who lost their lives. But it was a powerful reminder to us that we have the power to change our country. Now, there are some people, including, lots of young people who like to burn it all down. And I'm not one of them because I believe the 14th Amendment is so powerful. It has yet to be realized. We are leaving things on the table that are powerful parts of our history that we have the ability to pick up and to continue to try and press forward. And this history, the arc of this history, has to get down in us so that we understand what has happened to us and what we're capable of doing, both for ill and for good. And as we think about what happens after this next election and the country that we want to live in, the reason I'm creating this center at Howard Law School is to begin to try and advance a narrative and invite conversations. It's a very collaborative project with journalists, with members of the business community. What are our 14th Amendment obligations to democracy? If you lead a corporation, and I'm sure there's some corporate leaders in here, the Supreme Court decided that corporations are persons under the 14th Amendment. And I won't even get into the nefarious story of how that decision happened. But in any case, you got that. And that's a benefit to you. What are your 14th Amendment responsibilities to our democracy? Or do you just get personhood and that allows you to bring certain lawsuits and to protect yourself? We all have responsibilities as individual citizens, but also as democratic institutions, as journalists, as business leaders, as faith institutions. All of our democratic institutions now, in my view, have to begin to see our democratic responsibilities differently. I'm sure everyone here is registered to vote, and I'm sure you vote in every election, and I'm telling you it's not good enough.
Sherrilyn, first applause for that. It is moving and important to tell this history in this distilled way. What I want to do now is build on what Sherrilyn said about those two forces, the spirit of white supremacy and the spirit of insurrection, thwarting Reconstruction, and take it up to the civil rights era, and that will set up this question of the response to demagogues and insurrection today. So let me do this again in an intense and distilled way as I can. The fear, it was the failure of enforcement that thwarted Reconstruction. Justice Bradley says it's too much, the black people have to lift themselves up from slavery, and there was one brief shining moment in the 1890s when Senator Lodge proposed a new force bill that would have allowed Congress to actually enforce black voting rights, but that failed because of a compromise with the white supremacist. And the National Constitution Center is nonpartisan. I'm not allowed to, have any opinions whatsoever to sway things in one direction or another. But you cannot read this history without being shocked at the openness and notoriousness of the white supremacism. Woodrow Wilson runs for president in 1912 and writes an article for The Atlantic denouncing the indolent and insolent black people and says that they have to, be put down so that their voting rights can't be enforced. And that's the consensus view, and that's why voting rights are not enforced.
And by the way, removes black people from civil service, just since we've been talking about that a lot lately.
Repeatedly, just segregates the federal government using the very executive power that he had denounced as a candidate and said that states' rights had to control. So the level of hypocrisy is remarkable. Now, there's one important dissenting voice in that period, and that's John Marshall Harlan, named after the great Chief Justice, a Supreme Court justice who was determined to efface the legacy of Dred Scott. When he wrote his dissenting opinion in the civil rights cases in 1883, he had writer's block. His wife found the inkwell that Chief Justice Taney had used to write the Dred Scott decision. He saw the ink on his desk, and suddenly he was struck by divine inspiration, and the words flowed out of him. And he said, someday this decision will be as notorious as the Dred Scott decision, and it will be effaced. When Thurgood Marshall prepared for the Brown versus Board of Education decision, he read Marshall's dissent in the civil rights cases and his dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson aloud for inspiration. He argued to the court that separate but equal was unequal, and the court agreed. After having initially voted to uphold segregation, fortuitously the Chief Justice, Fred Vinson, died. Felix Frankfurter unkindly remarked, "This is the first evidence I've had that there is a God." Vinson is replaced by Earl Warren, by President Eisenhower. He, one by one, goes to the dissenting justices, makes the decision unanimous. He reads it to a spellbound courtroom. Thurgood Marshall can't believe it. He looks up at Stanley Reed, the great segregationist justice. "You voted for this too, Stanley Reed?" And Reed nods down silently. "I've done it," because he thought it was important for the country. That spirit of unity was embraced by the court and led by Marshall. And then the civil rights movement, as Sherrilyn said, the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, fulfilling the promise that had been thwarted in 1883 and upheld by the Supreme Court under a broad nationalistic vision of congressional power, quoting John Marshall's great decision in McCulloch versus Maryland. My next book is about how the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson, between national power and states' rights, defined all of American history at every stage. And that initial battle over the Bank of the United States, with Hamilton and Marshall saying that Congress's power should be broad, and Jefferson embracing strict constructionalism and originalism and saying it should be narrow, defined all of our battles over Dred Scott, over the Civil Rights era cases, over the New Deal, over the Civil Rights Act, and today our debates about originalism versus living constitutionalism on the court are recapitulating that initial battle between Hamilton and Jefferson. But the court in the civil rights cases embraces a broad vision of congressional power, yet it's not until the federal government pledges to take away school funding in 1968 that Brown is actually enforced. This is a really crucial point. Brown declared segregation unconstitutional in '54, but meaningful desegregation did not occur until the Department of Health and Human Services threatened to withhold federal funding in 1868 from schools that segregated, and then they got religion and actually desegregated. Reinforcing, it seems to me, Sherrilyn, the overwhelming story that you need a national federal commitment to enforcement of civil rights in order to make it real. There's one other big theme that I want to put on the table to set up our final discussion and conversation with you about insurrection, and that's the fact that in all of these periods, the Insurrection Act was generally invoked on behalf of the side of the angels, on behalf of actually enforcing black civil rights. Grant invoked the Insurrection Act to enforce, to put down the Klan. During the Civil Rights era, Johnson enforced it at Pettus Bridge to put down the segregationists like Wallace, who were invoking Thomas Jefferson and pledging massive resistance. It was originally created by Thomas Jefferson in 1807, and most of the invocations of the Insurrection Act throughout history have actually been on behalf of national power and trying to stop Southern secessionists from resisting. So my concern, Sherrilyn, there are many things to be concerned about our current situation, but when you think about the fact that what was the founders' greatest fear? Demagogues who would incite insurrection and encourage authoritarianism. So there are two amazing quotations. First, Hamilton, when he's not sure that the Constitution will succeed, says that he's afraid that a future Caesar on horseback will come and flatter the people and persuade them voluntarily to surrender liberty and reap the whirlwind. And then there's this amazing letter from Jefferson to Madison. When he first gets the Constitution, he says, I got two objections. First, there's no Bill of Rights. And second, I'm afraid that at some point in the distant future, a presidential candidate, because he's eligible for run for re-election, may lose the election by a few votes, cry foul, enlist the states who voted for him to refuse to leave office, and install himself as a dictator. It's astonishing. Jefferson's solution is a one-year term limit for president, because a one-term limit, because he doesn't want anyone to be tempted to steal an election. Hamilton wants a president for life, so that presidents won't be tempted. But both of them are centrally afraid of demagogues, but the solution for both of them is a president who's actually committed to union, and that's what Lincoln does when he invokes the Insurrection Act to put down secession. So Sherrilyn, my concern is that in addition to everything else, unless you have a president and a national government who's actually determined to use federal power to enforce civil rights and maintain union rather than thwart insurrection, we may be even worse trouble than I feared.
Yeah, I don't agree. You've now got me spooked. I absolutely agree with you. I actually can't. This lady right here with the white hair, ma'am, could you come? Could you come? Because there's an empty seat, and I just can't watch you standing there anymore. Come on. Come on. Yeah. Right here in the front row. Okay, oof, now I can focus again. Jeff, you're absolutely right. It's quite frightening to behold. I mean, I guess I want to take two steps back again because, putting down demagogues can be whack-a-mole. I mean, we have fortunately not had to deal with that in this country historically in ways that we may be confronting it now. But how is it made possible? I mean, I'm more interested in getting at the poison than getting at the manifestation of it. And you and I were talking outside, and I was saying, if you know you have diabetes in your family, you're going to do certain things, right? You're going to eat you're going to eat a certain way, you're going to exercise, you're going to get certain kinds of tests regularly, whatever, heart disease, whatever's in your family. When you know that, when you know it's in your DNA, right? You create some protective measures. Doesn't mean, it's no guarantee. You could still get it, but you try to avoid it. If you know that white supremacy is in your national DNA, again, this is not to call any individual person racist, and we're all grown-ups. So everybody take a deep breath and just calm down, right? It exists within our history. It's part of our DNA. There are periods of time when we have done better at managing it and periods of time when we've done worse, and it ever will be, right? Because again, your DNA is your DNA. But when you know it, and when you can accept it, when you're not freaked out at the thought that it exists, then you can begin to do the protective measures. And I think this country actually had done a pretty good job of creating a number of protective measures. Some of them were about law, Jeff, and those are the ones I like the most because I like law because it's there on the paper. But some of them were about the norms that we had created between ourselves. Some of them were about the kind of ethical ways that we conduct ourselves. If you heard certain things in the workplace, you were not going to be advanced, right? Because we had a kind of a social contract. And I just want to, norms are, like right now, there are norms. You all aren't leaning on people, you're tired and it's hot, but you're not like leaning on someone you don't know. You're not like fanning someone next to you. You're not drinking out of their glass. Not because it's illegal, right? But because, right? We don't do that, right? And those things hold us together too. And what demagogues do is they unravel, right? They don't start with law because laws are harder to unravel. Laws require you to get Congress, and you got to get legislatures involved, and there got to be elections and all kinds of referenda. They start with norms and ethics. They start by doing things that would have been verboten. They start by making fun of disabled people. They start by saying things about people's race or gender. They start by making us comfortable with relaxing the norms that we had developed to manage this thing that's in our DNA. You ever decide that you're going to lose some weight, like I'm always doing, and you say, and therefore I'm not having any sweets, until whatever, right? And then you just have one piece of cake and it's a wrap. Now every day, do you know what I mean, right? So that's what they do. They accustom you to something that is not good for you, and before you know it, it's normalized. So those are the things we're not aware that we need to protect against. So demagogues are doing that first and foremost. They're unraveling the ethics that hold us together. That means there are certain things that if you do it, I'm going to think lesser of you, and you are going to have breached the rules of, we live by ethics in our profession. You're going to have breached the rules of our profession that say, I've been a civil rights lawyer for 30 years. No one more zealously believes in the cause of their clients than I do. I would go toe-to-toe with anyone on that. But I would not stand in front of a court or a judge and make a misrepresentation of law or fact, because I'm an officer of the court, and ethically, that is verboten, right? So there are certain things that are holding us together, and they're not all law. And what demagogues do is they begin to unravel all of that. Jefferson and Hamilton were correct to be afraid, but I think they believed that in norms. I mean, they talked about it. That this was an office for high men. I mean, certainly they didn't think women, but I would say high men and women, And I think of this about the Supreme Court as well. It's the pinnacle of your career. That's how I think about it. You have distinguished yourself as a lawyer, and then you become a judge, and then that's how I thought it went, I'm just saying, these are norms that they matter. They matter. And I think for Hamilton and for Jefferson and for many of us, we couldn't imagine that there might be people who would breach the norms, and they may not have violated the law, and in some instances they may have. But the point is that we believe that they would respect the norms of office. And so I think part of what we're experiencing right now is we're shook because when we see this rise of a demagogue, especially in the first years, we couldn't point to anything illegal, and so we didn't know what to do, because the person was running roughshod through norms and ethics, right? And so it's an opportunity for us in this third founding, see how I brought that around? To think about what are the places we need to tighten up. And that's really what I think is the job before us, is that we now have to be thinking about, we can be wrong. It's okay to be wrong in a democracy because we're always making decisions, and sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong. The question is, what do we do when we get it wrong? And it may be that Jefferson and Hamilton's notion doesn't really work anymore, that these will be high-minded men who will, want to sacrifice and so forth. And that now we have to put some things in law that used to be in the norms and ethics bucket. And now we have to create new laws to close some of those loopholes. And that we have to get serious about enforcement. And that's why knowing this history is so important. When you hear a policy discussion, as we very often do, that we're going to get rid of birthright citizenship, it's not like a thing that somebody just thought was a good idea. It's in the Constitution. Are they saying they're going to amend the, because at least push on that point. Then you're saying you're going to amend the Constitution. That's what you're saying? You're saying you're going to remove it from the Constitution? It's not a policy idea that somebody came up with. It's a constitutional provision, a right that's in the 14th Amendment. So I think our ability to even know how we can create some of the protections that will protect us against what Hamilton and Jefferson feared, but perhaps had not protected us against enough, is first this reckoning, this honesty with what is in our DNA, the willingness to create protective measures that will protect us against the things that can harm our country as a result of that, the recognition that we can learn in our democracy what works and what doesn't, and when something doesn't work, that we can correct it, and that not everything is about, just wait for the election. The election's going to be really important, but after the election, we have to have the will to make the kinds of changes that are necessary, and I don't hear us talking about that. I hear us making it as though it's magic, as though somebody gets elected and then, ooh, it's magic. It's only magic for the next 3 years. And then it's, again, we need some fundamental changes in the foundations of our democracy in which our citizens, that's you and I, individuals, as well as democratic institutions, do a forensic of our role as citizens, evaluate ourselves, and identify what we need to change, correct, strengthen in order to take perfecting our democracy to the next level. If we don't have the guts to do it, I don't think we make it. And when I talk about founders and framers, this is really important, Jeff. I did talk about Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony and so forth, but the thesis I'm rolling with is that we're all founders and framers. Founders and framers of the 14th Amendment were also those black sailors who would travel from New York to Washington, D.C., and if you came to Washington, D.C. in the antebellum period, they would arrest you and put you in jail, in the D.C. jail, if you were a black sailor, until your ship was leaving, or in South Carolina. And if no one claimed you for 30 days, they would sell you into slavery, even though you were a free black person from New York who had been a sailor. Those cases were cases people were talking about. That was part of the founding and the framing, was the fights over what equality means. The very fact that people are taking a stance about what bodily integrity means for women as citizens, which I happen to think is a privilege and immunity of citizenship, right? That makes us framers, because one day it will be instantiated, I believe, as a privilege and immunity of citizenship. And we are founders and framers because we, as the body politic, are pushing this idea that you cannot strip women of this power as citizens to be able to control their own bodies, that's first and foremost. And so I want to unlock in us the belief that we are all founders and framers, that we're not waiting for Congress in the room. They're waiting for us. They get the ideas from us. It's what we're putting out in the public. It's what we're fighting about. It's what we're writing about. It's what we're litigating about. That's what's churning the conversation. And so at this time when I think many of us feel powerless, I want us to feel more powerful about what we can create on the other end of this election.
Beautiful. Well, that is exactly... That is exactly the right note on which to end. The urgent importance, as Sherrilyn says, of educating yourself about American history so that we can learn from it together and avoid its mistakes and ensure the future of democracy. You can do that with the incredible resources that you've heard about today. I want you to go to the National Constitution Center's interactive Constitution and read the 14th Amendment and read its early drafts and see the efforts to enshrine voting rights, see them fall out. Read essays by America's greatest scholars, liberal and conservative, about every meaning of the various clauses, both historic and current. Sherrilyn and the National Constitution Center are going to work together to create a new interactive version of the Reconstruction amendments that deepen and enhance these resources so that you can learn from them. And throughout, be inspired, as Sherrilyn said, by the fact that it's ordinary citizens who are extraordinary in their devotion to liberty who have transformed the Constitution. Prince Hall in 1777, a freedman who invokes the Declaration. David Walker, John Fortier, who fights as a freeman in the Civil War and then establishes schools after. And think of Frederick Douglass calling on citizens to exercise self-reliance and to educate themselves, as he did when he found that golden book, The Columbian Orator, which he said changed his life. And he bought with bread on the streets of Baltimore. And he taught himself how to read by buying reading lessons with bread. And this book, with its dialogues about ending slavery and excerpts from classical moral philosophy, inspired him to be the greatest freedom fighter of his time. I want to end with an exhortation that John Quincy Adams, who was the greatest white opponent of slavery, had. In 1839, he's denouncing the gag rule in Congress. He's introducing a new amendment to end slavery. And he says the republic will fall and civil war will follow unless people educate themselves about the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. And then he quotes Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, and he says the following: take these principles of the Declaration and the Constitution, put them between your forehead as frontlets, whisper them to your children before you sleep, make them the very principles of your political salvation. That's exactly what we've got to do. Thank you so much.